Before we start with my presentation, I'd just like to make an observation from yesterday, from Peter's talk. If you cast your mind back to the large pentagram over Europe that he showed you, the left-hand foot of that pentagram at the southern bit of Italy is interestingly close to where Pythagoras had a school at Crotona, and that can't be a coincidence, can it? It's wonderful how these synchronicities occur, and of course, as you probably all know, that the pentagram was the emblem of the Pythagorean school, and there he was sitting at one of the major junction points of the Peter's Grail landscape. We get on with Lugh now. What I'm going to talk about today is the strange presence of Lugh within the landscape of London, which takes many forms. And just briefly, I'll fly over some information about who Lugh was. I mean, Anthony's covered most of it. But it's essentially, although he gets mixed up with the sun gods, I think he's more associated with light and has the power of the sun. And in the old Celtic traditions, the sun actually belonged to the goddesses, Ain and Bridget, the daughters of the Dagda, the great god. And Lugh is one of the shining ones. He is light, and he bears the light of the sun. Sorry, the slides have come out strangely small for some reason through the projector today. As Anthony mentioned earlier, we're going to overlap a little bit on some of the things that come up in the talk. The River Lea takes its name from Lugh, the ancient Celtic sun god, and flows through north and east London from Enfield right down to the Thames. And most references to the name simply say that it means shining or bright, but it derived from Lugh, the shining one, the ancient god. And the link with Lugh is confirmed with its source, which rises in Luton, which is Lugh's town. And Luton, I think, often gets overlooked. Well, it does get overlooked as an important energy centre. It's an amazing place. As Anthony said, it has the mythical line going right through it. It also has a direct line from Stonehenge to it. There are several old wonderful hills in the town itself, as well as Warlord's Bank. And this is the actual source of the River Lea. It doesn't look much there. It must have been taken on a dry day. But of course, it picks up so many tributaries on the way that it grows to the powerful river that we know. And this is an old map of Luton showing Warlord's Bank. And according to local legend, the spring is presided over by Lugh, Lugus, Lud or Lig. That's quotation from a local history book. So it's got a direct link to Lugh, because all those are different appellations of the same god. And Warlord's Bank is actually in the district of Leagrave, which is another connection to the Lugh name. And you can see that the Warlord's Bank has actually still got some pretty tall embankments and earthworks around it. It's jolly good. This, unfortunately, it's got a few other things around it as well, because the Luton Council decided it was a great place to put a few tower blocks in the 60s, and they don't really add to the atmosphere. And of course, the Lea ends up in the Thames here, just opposite the the terrible dome, and close to Canary Wharf, and it passes the Olympic Village and the Olympic Stadium on the way. Do you think we could close the curtains on that side and put a couple of lights down, because the slides are coming up a bit dark? Thanks. And this is how close the River Lea gets to the Olympic Stadium. It's actually enclosed by water on every side, like a sacred enclosure, which is quite interesting. So I've got a sneaking suspicion that this is some kind of sacred space that's being created there. I'll flick through these fairly quickly because it's just running through the route of the Lea down through Enfield and Chingford and Waltham Abbey and Cheshunt and Broxbourne. Actually, at Broxbourne, there's a great place where you can turn up and hire a bicycle and cycle along the path beside the Lea all the way up to Ware and Hertford. And on a sunny afternoon, it's a terrific way to take in a pilgrimage of the river. And earlier in the year, we did get round to doing our own pilgrimage to the River Lea. We went to the Hertford end of it, where the River Lea joins with three other rivers, the strangely named rivers of the Mimram, the Bean, and the Rib, all joined, so that four rivers come together at Hertford. And Hertford Castle is where we started the pilgrimage. And it's one of those places that has a history tied in with the Norman castle that was there. The current building that's on the slide is a Tudor period one. But I have a feeling that the area around Hertford Castle was a sacred space originally, not a place of military or strategic significance, even though it's evolved into a castle. And that's kind of hinted at by the fact that in 673 a synod was held there, which essentially established the first Church of England. So 400 years before the Normans were there building their castle, which they get all the credit for. This was a place that had some sacred significance, enough to host a synod. And I think all the bishops of Britain except one turned up. It's got a strange connection to the Earth stars discovery too, in that the Camelot site of the Earth stars discovery, the Camelot Moat, where a fortified manor house or small castle once stood. When it was demolished in 1439, the remains were taken away to help rebuild the walls of Hertford Castle. So when you go and visit Camelot Moat in North London and don't find a castle there on the material plane at least, that's because it's all been carted off to Hertford and built into the walls. And when we went here, we started the pilgrimage in the grounds beneath a large oak tree to listen to the voice of the site and tell us what if anything, useful we might do there. And one of the people with us said that they felt it was something to do with the blending of male and female energies and the balancing of those energies. And 10 minutes later, when we walked over to the castle itself, there was a wedding going on in there. So, that's confirmed that quite nicely. This is an ancient boundary stone that's outside Hertford Castle, and in fact there's another stone nearby that commemorates the synod. Boundary stones, again, are overlooked in their significance, I feel. If you look at Sir Montague Sharp's book on the ancient history of Hertfordshire, he says that the stone itself was sacred and it stood for a local god, or in the Roman periods it was a god called Terminus, he says, who was the god of boundaries. But prior to that, and John Michel confirms this in View over Atlantis, these boundary stones were sacred to the Celtic Mercury, who, of course, is Lugh by any other name. So, right outside the site of Hertford Castle is a stone that was probably originally dedicated to Lugh. And this was the second point on our pilgrimage, the castle mound beside the river, where we did one of those simple but wonderful Dr. Emoto blessings to the water of it's a very simple phrase that he uses, water we bless you, water we thank you, water we love you. And I love the simplicity of those blessings that he uses, and we did that at the bank here, and then cast a votive offering of the spear of Lugh into the waters. It was actually a spear that was left over from a school play, but it was the best we had. And just looking at the castle mound there, it reminds me that all of these castle mounds are attributed to the Normans, and I think it's another grossly unfair thing, because the Normans were just making use of stuff that was there originally, and it would have been an ancient British energy centre, power centre, a centre of administration. And the evidence to support that is at Merlin's Mound at Marlborough School, where the legend that Merlin was buried beneath that mound existed before the Normans got there, and carried on after they'd long gone. I suspect that all these mounds are Merlin's mounds in one way, and that he's another aspect of Lugh. And this is a strange landscape figure I found on a map of Hertford. To me, it looks like a deer, a hart, perhaps is another word for a deer, but there it is drinking at the ford in Hertford, and it's even got a couple of antlers. It's a very synchronistic figure. There are actually two deers on the landscape, but I didn't draw the other one on because it obscures the initial one. But there seems to be two landscape figures of deer or harts at Hertford. And I have a feeling that whenever I go to Hertford Castle, and it's the same at Berkhamsted Castle actually, I get the feeling that it was a big henge, and that the stones have been taken away, and that was the origin of it, a sacred enclosure where the rivers formed a sacred barrier around the henge. And so I think the area of Hertford Castle and Berkhamsted Castle too were sacred enclosures and very important ones. But then we come on to the figure of the lion, which is part of the Earth Star's discoveries. It's not as a zodiac, because there are only 3 or 4 landscape figures in the Earth Star's discovery. This is part of a pair of figures which represent the heraldic guardians, and the lion is on the eastern side of London, and on the western side is the figure of a unicorn, which of course are the heraldic guardians on the crest of the Queen and of Britain. And to find them emblazoned on the landscape at this sort of scale is rather encouraging, and it's surprising, but it's encouraging. It looks as if London is under some sort of divine protection, and of course between the 2 figures is the geometry of the Earth Star's temple, which connects up nicely with Peter's Grail line through the country, through the Kingston point of it. I don't believe that this figure is an ancient thing that's been on the landscape for millions of years. I think it's an expression of the spirit of the land, and the spirit of the land is alive and well and living and evolving, and it's been created over time, and even us humans get to lend a hand in doing things that we don't understand or have no conception of, because some of these roads that define it are fairly recent, some of them are old, but it's something that has come out of the spirit of the land itself, or as William Blake would call it, an emanation of Albion, and it's manifested as a lion. And of course, when we see these things, there's a part of our brain that is always looking for something that's recognizable in form or pattern, and uses that to complete the interaction between our conscious awareness and the spirit of the land of which we are a part. The reason why I have this is that in Welsh, Lugh means lion. So the lion is actually another aspect of the Celtic sun god Lugh, and that's his river, the River Lee, which runs through the back of the lion. The line itself extends pretty much into the city of London, and up here into Hainault Forest and Essex. It's defined by this, it's defined by this road that goes down into northeast London, but it also has the River Roding running alongside that, which could equally be used to define that pattern. So already we've got 2 images on the landscape of northeast London that could relate to Lugh as an energy within the land, and as part of the spirit of the land. Here we are. This is the A113 from Woodford to Chigwell, and as I said, the River Roding is running alongside it in a slightly more wibbly-wobbly fashion. The paws of the lion, because it's not a standing lion like the one on the crest. It's more sphinx-like. The paws of the lion go through Dagenham, and the body of the lion encompasses quite a lot of northeast London. This is a slightly different map, showing you more clearly some of the towns around there which are included in the figure of the lion, and of course several of them a strong Earth stars point. At Wanstead there's the St Gabriel's Church, which is part of a 5-point star, and down in East Ham is the old St Mary's Church and Barking Abbey, which are some of the key points of the Earth star's geometry. And even pathways and tracks of the area around the head, there's even a strange little crown shape which mirrors the crown that's on the coat of arms, on the lion on the coat of arms. And the coat of arms doesn't date back more than 700 years, really. So it's not likely to be an ancient figure at all. But it does emphasize the kingly, regal nature of the lion, which of course is one of its attributes, and the other one being solar energy, the solar lion. This is a broader picture of how the Earth Star's Geometry Temple in Greater London fits in with the lion and the unicorn. And on the crest, the lion is on the opposite side to how they stand on the landscape. But they do suggest that London is under some kind of divine protection, and also it emphasizes the function of the geometry as a landscape temple, because those two landscape figures represent the left and right pillars, the solar pillar, the lunar pillar. And of course, Lugh himself, as a figure of Mercury or Hermes, represents the central figure in many ways. So, rightly or wrongly, what occurred to me was that with these images, particularly on the Essex and Eastern London landscape, the images relating to Lugh suggest Lugh give the impression that he's an energy that's within the land or sleeps within the land, and so it makes a connection to the Arthur and Grail myths. And perhaps because Lugh is so much older than Arthur, who was, if he existed, was a 5th or 6th century person. But clearly the Arthurian legends were based on a much older tradition, and perhaps Lugh was the basis of that as the king who sleeps within the land. And perhaps he represents the sovereign power in the landscape. And to emphasize that, there's this alignment that runs from St. Paul's up into the head of the lion. I'm sorry the slide's so dark. This is probably the most important alignment of energy through London. It takes in down here at St. Paul's, Westminster Abbey, several other sites, and up here in the head of the lion, it goes through a place called Chigwell Row. But it's very much a royal line, and a line connected to the sovereignty of the land. It connects 3 sites of coronation, which is the Kingstone at Kingston-on-Thames, where 7 Saxon kings were crowned, Westminster Abbey, where our modern royalty are crowned, and St. Paul's, where an open-air druidic moot was used to select the next king in an election by his people and his peers. And that's fallen out of practice these days. The last king to undergo that procedure before his inauguration, I think, was Henry III. But quite a lot of the Plantagenet kings submitted themselves to an election by their public in the grounds of St. Paul's on the north side of the cathedral. And Edmund Ironsides was one, Edward the Confessor was another. And if they didn't get elected by their people and their peers in St. Paul's, they didn't get crowned at Westminster. It was that important. And these are some of the mark points on the line. There's a few strangely modern ones in there, like the Peace Pagoda in Battersea Park. And the point in Kingston is probably the parish church, where the stone was kept in the parish church for quite a long time before it was moved a few hundred yards down the road to outside the law courts. But in central London, it goes through Westminster Abbey, Houses of Parliament, Jubilee Gardens, it clips the edge of County Hall and the Oxo Tower, goes through St Andrew's by the Wardrobe, strangely named church, which sounds as if it's got something to do with IKEA, but I think it was Edward IV had a storage place for his extensive clothes round the corner. Through St Paul's and St Vedast and the lovely ruins of St Mary Aldermanbury, which is on the corner of Love Lane, just round the corner from the Guildhall. Through Moorgate Station, which I'm told is the former site of a nunnery, but I haven't found the reference to that yet. And then through a couple of modern chapels, and through the mount at Arnold Circus, which is a strange mound whose antiquity is disputed hotly by various people, but it's as well as being on this line, it's on at least 3 other alignments linking sites of antiquity. So my suspicion is that it's a genuine mound, or that it marks the site of something else that was pretty ancient. And it goes through what may be the possible site of the Leighton Stone, and ends up at the crossroads in Chigwell Row, in the Head of the Lion, where there's a pub called the Maypole, which suggests a ritual site. And it's at a crossroads on a hilltop. There's a church about 50 yards down the road with some wonderful old yews in it. And to confirm, in the old straight track, Alfred Watkins actually regarded crossroads as valid mark points for lays and stretches of old road. And where this alignment goes up to the crossroads near the Maypole pub, it actually follows the road into the crossroads. It runs along it. And a few hundred yards down the road in the opposite direction is a pub called the Camelot, just to add to the weird synchronicities. This is the mount at Arnold Circus, which in an old book on the Gypsy language, there's a reference to it, and it says that it was demolished and flattened after the time of Popery. But I have a sneaking suspicion that what they mean was, the word they used was levelled, and I think this was as big as Merlin's Mound at Marlborough originally, and they've levelled it down to 30 or 40 feet. because the mound is certainly still there. This is the ruins of St Mary Aldermanbury at the corner of Love Lane, and that's a wonderful tranquil place, frequently used by city workers to have their lunch. And that's the Kingstone at Kingston on Thames. A couple of sites that aren't listed there is the Priory of St John at Holborn. The line seems to go through just before it gets to the mound at Arnold Circus. And also beneath the Guild Hall is an amphitheatre, which is said to be Roman, and the line also clips the edge of that. So it's pretty well marked. And to my mind, this is an axis of solar energy, of the real power of the sun, and it represents the power of the sacred king and the sovereign. It's also got a caduceus effect in the way that it snakes, the Thames snakes around it, and between Kingston and St Paul's, the Thames crosses the alignment 7 times, so you have this wonderful blending of the water and the fire energy of this midsummer sunrise alignment, working like a real caduceus on the landscape. This is the point at Chigwell Row where this royal alignment ends up. And because that was the Maypole pub there, it suggests a celebration at Beltane at May Day. So I worked out the May Day sunrise there, and it goes back to Primrose Hill, which is also a great place of ritual, and even today used by the Druid order for marking the 8 ceremonies of the year. And taking a parallel to that through St Paul's, there could be this is either a Beltane alignment or a Lunasad alignment, and whereas the corridor line, the royal line, goes through the north side of the Olympic Village, the Lunasad alignment would go right through the Olympic Park, the main arena. And I've only recently been investigating this, so I haven't plotted all the sites along that line. And in fact, I haven't plotted many of them at all. But it seems likely that when I do, some interesting things will turn up. But again, it seems beyond coincidence that the midsummer sunrise alignment from Ludgate Hill, St Paul's, is going to take in the Olympic Village north side, and the Lunasad alignment and Beltane alignments will actually go through the south side and right through the Olympic Stadium. And that got me thinking, is one of those alignments Lugh's spear of light, which is talked about in legend? And of course, literally, they're all axes of light. They're axes of power and vision and solar energy. Even though Lugh is not a sun god, he does seem to be associated with the light of the sun and the sovereignty of the sacred king. And so I began to think of this midsummer sunrise axis that connects the lion, who is Lugh, to Ludgate Hill, which may be named after Lugh. I began to think of that as Lugh's spear or sword. And then I stumbled upon the fact that Sir Thomas Malory very clearly says that in Morte d'Arthur, that Arthur drew the sword from the stone in the churchyard of the greatest church in London, which would have been St. Paul's, because Westminster Abbey was outside the city in those days. And so out of this solar alignment is maybe the site where Arthur's sovereignty arose. And so at one end of it we have the sleeping lion in the land, and at the other end of it we have the once and future king claiming his power. So this is a very important alignment linked to the sovereignty of Britain and the royal line of Grail kings. And it actually goes right through the spot where Sir Thomas Malory says King Arthur pulled the sword from the stone. Because he describes it as a stone in the north side of the churchyard, close to the altar. And in fact, there was a stone in exactly that position. And this is what marks the site of that stone. It's Paul's cross, the original Paul's cross. But originally it was called Old Paul's Cross, P-O-L, or Old Paul's Stump, which referred to the stump of the stone that was left into which the cross was set. And it was very common practice years ago to take a megalithic stone and put a cross in it to Christianize it. There are quite a few examples in Cornwall where many more stones remain. And also, its position on this midsummer sunrise axis may mean that it was actually a king's stone, which was set outside the main circle of stones if there was a megalithic monument here, just as the king's stone at the Rollright Stones still is, marking the midsummer sunrise there, or the heel stone at Stonehenge. And I think the heel stone name actually comes from Helios the sun, Helios Apollo. Although that's a Greek name for him, but the Druid Greek. There's a strange story in one of John Michel's books about a traveller who was walking in Ireland, and he lost his way, and the first person he came across was a young shepherd tending his sheep, and the shepherd, unbeknown to him, was under the tutelage of a local hedge druid. And when the guy asked him for directions, he couldn't understand English, but he could reply in ancient Greek that the druid had spoken to him. And that's in one of John Michel's books of old articles that he wrote in the Oldie magazine. So here we are at St. Paul's, where there may have been a stone, and it may have been the stone that Arthur drew the sword from. This is the current Paul's Cross, which is a monument that dates back only 150, 160 years, and it was put up as a monument. There's a little bit of information about the Druid moot that was held in the northern part of the churchyard. It was held 3 times a year. The midsummer solstice was one of the times that it was traditionally held, and the midwinter solstice was another time that it was traditionally held. The third occasion is most likely to have been either Beltane or Lughnasadh, but it's not recorded. And of course, when there was going to be a coronation or something, they would hold an impromptu one beyond those 3 times. And of course, everyone in the guidebook it'll tell you that Old Paul's Cross and Old Pol relate to St. Paul, but nowhere else in the world is he referred to as Pol. And when I was working with this intuitively, I was told that it wasn't Paul, it was Apollo. And so Paul's Cross, where the stone was, is on a midsummer sunrise alignment on a stone that was dedicated to Apollo, the sun god, and may have been a king's stone of a megalithic monument. The other interesting thing there is that the East Saxons who inhabited London also had a sun god called Balder the Beautiful, and he was also called Pol. It was a name also used for Balder. So whoever you choose to think Pol was, he was the sun god, not old St. Paul. So there we have it. This was a place where kings were made, and what they were doing was tapping into I got a feeling that the coronation process was rather like the process in Egypt where the pharaoh became the living embodiment of the sun god. And I think that the sacred kings of Britain underwent the same thing at their coronation. They were crowned with the glory and the power of the sun. The crown actually represents the glory of the sun, the corona. That's where the word comes from. So when the king was crowned, he was taking on the incarnation of the powers of the sun god of the time, who may have been Lugh, but in more recent times is Apollo. We have a statue there where Apollo is depicted as the Greek Mercury with a bow and arrow. But it seems likely as well that this stone was related to Lugh as much as the later gods. And as I said, the stone was exactly where Mallory said it ought to be. So this makes a very important alignment linked to the sovereignty of Britain and the royal line of Grail kings. Arthur was Pendragon, and Pendragon even today is a title within the Druid order, and head of the dragon. And you can translate that as someone who controls the dragon force. And the symbolism of drawing the sword from the stone represents the conscious or willful control of that energy through that spot. The conscious control of the dragon energy or the fiery energy of this alignment. And by pulling the sword from the stone on this alignment, Arthur took control of that power and became the embodiment of the sun god, whoever it was. And so Lugh may be the pre-Arthurian embodiment of the king who sleeps within the land, and his power is still flowing through that alignment. And it's still there for us to tap into in our own way. Last year we had two groups that did pilgrimages to St. Paul's to draw our own swords of power from the location of the old stone. And it was a very interesting experience. It's a very empowering thing. I recommend that anyone who can get there on the solstice next year goes along, and they conveniently put benches all around where the stone was. So you can sit on the bench and you can visualize the stone there or its etheric counterpart, and of course all this was organized by Merlin's power. He was the element behind the scenes that arranged it all. And so you might find his presence there as well. I was quite surprised to sense that when we did the exercise. But this link to the Arthurian myths and legends runs all through the Earth Star's discovery. That it began virtually at a place that's still called Camelot today, and was actually had a castle there. And many people, including myself, believe that there's an inner world Grail castle at that particular site that's accessible. And of course the Earth Star's geometry is virtually identical to the geometry that was used to lay out the stones of Stonehenge, which in myth was put there by Merlin's art. So if Stonehenge is Merlin's art, so is the Earth Star's geometry. And then in amongst it we have this amazing alignment that identifies the place where Arthur drew the sword from the stone. And raises the question of, does Arthur's stone still exist? And I think it does, because less than a quarter of a mile from St. Paul's is the London stone, which is said to be the foundation stone of the city, and the foundation myth of the city revolves around Brutus the Trojan, who set up his foundation stone on Ludgate Hill to mark the foundation of the city and also the foundation of his temple of Diana, Diana Artemis. But if that's the case, the foundation stone should be on Ludgate Hill, where the temple of Diana is supposed to be, and which it was the center of Brutus's city. It should be up there on the hill, not down here in Cannon Street, stuck in the wall of a Chinese bank. And there's no doubt there was a temple of Diana on Ludgate Hill, because there is a temple, an altar, a Roman altar dedicated to Diana that was unearthed when Goldsmiths Hall was developed in the 1860s. And I don't believe it's ever been put on public display. It's on display inside Goldsmiths Hall, but of course that's not open to the public. But there it is, a Diana altar that was found on Ludgate Hill, 100 yards or so from St. Paul's. And of course there's the Diana chambers as well on the south side of St. Paul's, the underground chambers that were discovered when Wren excavated the ruins of the old cathedral to build the new one. And I think Wren actually incorporated a lot of what he found into the cathedral. If there was a classic temple of Diana there, it's still there in the basement, recreated as that circle of 8 pillars that's beneath the dome. And that's how the London stone used to look when it was set into the wall of St. Swithin's Church, which stood next to where it currently is. St. Swithin's was demolished in 1972, I think. To make way for one of those lovely office blocks that Prince Charles loves so much. And that's what it looks like if you shove your camera through the grill and try and get a photograph of the stone. It's not very big. It looks like it might be the top of a stone, or indeed a stump, which would tie in with Pole's stump. Currently, you're not allowed in the building to take photographs from the inside of it because it's being redeveloped. And I was really amazed to find that the developer doing this building work is called Minerva. But it's part of the Walbrook development, and at one point the London Stone was going to be thrown in a skip by builders who were working on the building, and the Chinese bank had been temporarily replaced by a sports shop, where the manager of the shop realised that this was a treasured antiquity and got them to take it out of the skip and leave it where it was. But since then, the Museum of London have taken an interest, and the developers have been alerted to it, and if it is moved, it will go to the London Museum while a redevelopment takes place, and then be put back in a place designed for it. And there would be moves afoot for it to be done with a proper Druid ceremony. So that's pretty much it. To reiterate, actually, what Peter ended his talk with yesterday, the wisdom of the ancient Druids is an open secret, and it's on public display all around us in nature, encoded in our sacred landscapes and in our ancient sacred sites, and it just takes us to go and look for these things and observe nature as our ancestors did. And some things are more difficult to find than others. I think Nick's discoveries from Avebury are something I wouldn't have ever found, because it requires that specialist astrological knowledge. But there's plenty out there for us to find, and if I'm in London at next summer solstice, I'd like to invite you to join me at St Paul's and have a dabble with Lugh's spear or Arthur's sword, whichever way you look at it. And before we end, as Lugh's spear of light goes through the Olympic Stadium, I'm very tempted to put a tenner on Britain getting an Olympic gold in the javelin. And on that silly note, I'll leave it there. For anyone who wants to read more about that, my book London's Camelot has the information about Arthur's stone and Arthurian connections, the coronation lines in the ley line book, and the visionary landscape book. So thank you for listening. Oh crikey, I've gone over the time a bit. Even though it's evolved into a castle, and that's kind of hinted at by the fact that in 673 a synod was held there, which essentially established the first Church of England. So 400 years before the Normans were there building their castle, which they get all the credit for. This was a place that had some sacred significance, enough to host a synod. And I think all the bishops of Britain except one turned up. It's got a strange connection to the Earth stars discovery too, in that the Camelot site of the Earth stars discovery, the Camelot moat, where a fortified manor house or small castle once stood. When it was demolished in 1439, the remains were taken away to help rebuild the walls of Hertford Castle. So when you go and visit Camelot Moat in North London and don't find a castle there on the material plane at least, that's because it's all been carted off to Hertford and built into the walls. And when we went here, we started the pilgrimage in the grounds beneath a large oak tree to listen to the voice of the site and tell us what if anything, useful we might do there. And one of the people with us said that they felt it was something to do with the blending of male and female energies and the balancing of. But before we start with my presentation, I'd just like to make an observation from yesterday, from Peter's talk. If you cast your mind back to the large pentagram over Europe that he showed you, the left-hand foot of that pentagram at the southern bit of Italy is interestingly close to where Pythagoras had a school at Crotona, and that can't be a coincidence, can it? It's wonderful how these synchronicities occur, and of course, as you probably all know, that the pentagram was the emblem of the Pythagorean school, and there he was sitting at one of the major junction points of the Peter's Grail landscape. We get on with Lugh now. What I'm going to talk about today is the strange presence of Lugh within the landscape of London, which takes many forms. And just briefly, I'll fly over some information about who Lugh was. I mean, and Anthony's covered most of it. But it's essentially, although he gets mixed up with the sun gods, I think he's more associated with light and has the power of the sun. And in the old Celtic traditions, the sun actually belonged to the goddesses, Ain and Bridget, the daughters of the Dagda, the great god. And Lugh is one of the shining ones. He is light, and he bears the light of the sun. That this is some kind of sacred space that's being created there. I'll flick through these fairly quickly because it's just running through the route of the lead down through Enfield and Chingford and Waltham Abbey and Cheshunt and Broxbourne. Actually, at Broxbourne, there's a great place where you can turn up and hire a bicycle and cycle along the path beside the Lea all the way up to Ware and Hertford. And on a sunny afternoon, it's a terrific way to take in a pilgrimage of the river. And earlier in the year, we did get round to doing our own pilgrimage to the River Lea. We went to the Hertford end of it, where the River Lea joins with three other rivers, the strangely named rivers of the Mimram, the Bean, and the Rib, all joined so that four rivers come together at Hertford. And Hertford Castle is where we started the pilgrimage, and it's one of those places that has a history tied in with the Norman castle that was there. The current building that's on the slide is a Tudor period one, but I have a feeling that the area around Hertford Castle was a sacred space originally, not a place of military or strategic significance. Over by Lugus, Lud or Lig, that's quotation from a local history book. So it's got a direct link to Lugh. Because all those are different appellations of the same god. And Wallard's Bank is actually in the district of Lugh, which is another connection to the Lugh name. And you can see that the Wallard's Bank has actually still got some pretty tall embankments and earthworks around it. It's jolly good. This, unfortunately, it's got a few other things around it as well, because the Luton Council decided it was a great place to put a few tower blocks in the 60s, and they don't really add to the atmosphere. And of course, the Lee ends up in the Thames here, just opposite the terrible dome. And close to Canary Wharf, and it passes the Olympic Village and the Olympic Stadium on the way. Do you think we could close the curtains on that side and put a couple of lights down, because the slides are coming up a bit dark? Thanks. And this is how close the River Lee gets to the Olympic Stadium. It's actually enclosed by water on every side, like a sacred enclosure, which is quite interesting. So I've got a sneaking suspicion there's sorry, the slides have come out strangely small for some reason through the projector today. As Anthony mentioned earlier, we're going to overlap a little bit on some of the things that have come up in the talk. The River Lee takes its name from Lugh, the ancient Celtic sun god, and flows through North and East London from Enfield right down to the Thames. And most references to the name simply say that it means shining or bright. But it derived from Lugh, the Shining One, the ancient god. And the link with Lugh is confirmed with its source, which rises in Luton, which is Lugh's town. And Luton, I think, often gets overlooked. Well, it does get overlooked as an important energy centre. It's an amazing place. As Anthony said, it has the mythical line going right through it. It also has a direct line from Stonehenge to it. There are several old wonderful hills in the town itself, as well as Wallard's Bank. And this is the actual source of the River Lee. It doesn't look much there. It must have been taken on a dry day. But of course, it picks up so many tributaries on the way that it grows to the powerful river that we know. And this is an old map of Luton showing Wallard's Bank. And according to local legend, the spring is presided over